Before the world ever asked Superman to choose, the world had already decided what power was supposed to mean. Power was gravity made visible. It pressed downward. It demanded hierarchy, obedience, submission. It crowned itself early and built walls to protect its throne. The modern imagination did not invent this logic, but it perfected its spectacle. Strength was meant to rule. Vision was meant to dominate. Moral clarity was meant to justify force after the fact. Superman enters this landscape quietly, not as an answer, but as a disruption already in motion. He does not arrive into chaos. He arrives into order, a settled world, a world convinced it understands itself. The cities are standing. The institutions are functioning. Violence is normalized, controlled, ritualized. Power has rules, even when those rules are unjust. This is not a civilization in collapse. It is a civilization confident enough to believe collapse only happens elsewhere. That confidence is the foundation of the tension. Not a single villain is required for it to exist. The figure descending from the sky is not immediately read as a threat. He is framed as an anomaly, then a curiosity, then a symbol. The world projects onto him faster than it understands him. He becomes a reflection surface. Hope, fear, envy, relief. All of it sticks. The spotlight turns on before the inner structure is ever examined. What matters at first is not who he is, but what he appears to solve. Superman is introduced as a solution to visible problems. Crime, disaster, war scaled down to individual events. He lifts what is falling. He stops what is burning. He absorbs impact without protest. From the outside, this looks like rescue. From a symbolic distance, it looks like containment. A force that could destabilize the system is immediately assigned a function inside it. The deeper question does not surface yet. It does not need to. The system feels reinforced by his presence. The walls seem stronger when someone stands in front of them. But the fissure is already there. It was there before he landed. Superman does not struggle to gain power. He struggles to regulate it. That difference is subtle enough to be missed by a culture trained to admire ascent and conquest. There is no montage of becoming, no arc of accumulation. His strength does not increase through conflict. It is constant, relentless, present even when unused. This alone places him outside the dominant myth of modern heroism. He does not need the world to validate him. The world needs him to validate itself. That imbalance is where the unease begins to form. The presence of absolute capacity inside a relative system creates pressure. Not immediate pressure, but structural pressure, like a load-bearing column added to a building that was never designed to carry it. Nothing collapses at first, but nothing is neutral anymore either. Every action becomes charged by what could have happened but did not. He could intervene here. He could prevent that. He could end this. The sentence repeats itself endlessly in the background of the narrative, like a low-frequency hum beneath the visible plot. The audience hears it even when the characters do not say it aloud. Superman's restraint is not framed as absence. It is framed as choice. And choice implies judgment. This is where the moral field quietly shifts. The moment restraint is noticed, expectation forms around it. Expectation hardens into demand. Demand eventually turns into accusation. Why here and not there? Why now and not before? The world begins to negotiate with his silence. Clark Kent appears inside this negotiation not as disguise, but as boundary. A narrowing of presence, a deliberate reduction of scale. He occupies offices, desks, conversations that do not matter in the global sense. He listens more than he speaks. He hesitates. He misjudges. He allows himself to be unseen. This is not weakness. It is calibration. The narrative treats this as humility. The culture treats it as irony, a god pretending to be small. But the deeper function is more unsettling. This is power choosing limitation not because it must, but because it understands consequence. And consequence is the word modern culture struggles to sit with. In stories shaped by acceleration, immediacy, and spectacle, consequence is something that happens to others. Villains suffer it. Systems collapse elsewhere. The hero acts and the world resets. Superman resists this rhythm by refusing to become the engine of resolution. He absorbs shock without releasing it outward. That refusal is read, increasingly, as failure. The tension does not explode. It accumulates. Superman becomes a fixed point around which other characters orbit. Governments watch him. Criminals test him. Civilians pray to him or resent him. Each interaction adds weight. Not to him physically, but to the symbolic structure he inhabits. He becomes a center of gravity that cannot move without shifting everything else. And yet he does not claim the center. He stands near it, adjacent to it, always close enough to act, never close enough to rule. This is where the story quietly diverges from what the culture expects it to be. The ideal is not unreachable. It is unreadable, not because it is abstract, but because it contradicts the emotional economy of domination and release that modern narratives are built on. Superman does not externalize his conflict. He internalizes restraint. He does not conquer opposition. He contains it. He does not seek recognition. He manages visibility. The spotlight follows him regardless, but he never steps fully into it. The opening movement of his story is therefore not about arrival, but about misalignment. A being structured around balance, entering a system structured around escalation. The conflict is not personal yet. It is architectural, a mismatch between what power could be and what power is allowed to mean. Nothing breaks in this phase. Nothing collapses. That is what makes it dangerous. The foundation is stable enough to carry the contradiction for a while. But every structure has limits. Every system resists what it cannot integrate. And Superman, standing exactly where integration would require transformation, becomes the silent pressure point the culture has not learned how to read. Superman does not originate from lack. He is not forged by deprivation, nor sharpened by resentment. His origin stands apart from the dominant grammar of modern heroism precisely because it refuses trauma as its primary engine. Krypton does not fall because of moral corruption or divine punishment. It collapses through inevitability, through structural finality, through a failure of foresight rather than a failure of ethics. This matters. The loss that shapes him is impersonal. It is cosmic rather than psychological. There is grief, but it is not intimate. There is exile, but not abandonment. He arrives on Earth without the wound that usually fuels mythic ascent. There is no rage seeking direction, no hunger demanding conquest. What he carries instead is surplus, excess capacity, a body calibrated for more than the world requires. From the very beginning, the central tension is not how he will gain power, but how he will live inside a system that cannot metabolize what he already has. The solar relationship is essential here, not as spectacle, but as structure. His power does not come from extraction or accumulation. It comes from alignment. He does not burn fuel. He resonates. The sun is not consumed. It is mirrored. Energy flows without depletion. This establishes a psychology of abundance rather than scarcity. A being who does not fear running out does not need to dominate in order to secure position. This places Superman in direct contrast with the moral logic of Earth, which is built on limitation. Time is limited. Bodies are fragile. Authority is contested. Violence exists because vulnerability exists. Every institution is a response to finitude. Law emerges to manage conflict. Force emerges to settle what law cannot. Hierarchies emerge to stabilize chaos by concentrating power where it can be enforced. Superman enters this ecosystem as an impossibility. He is not subject to the pressures that shaped it, yet he chooses to live within it. That choice is the core of his psychology, not belonging by necessity but by decision. Krypton represents a completed structure, not a utopia, but a system that has resolved its internal contradictions to the point of rigidity. There is knowledge, order, coherence. There is also stagnation. The planet dies not because it is immoral, but because it is finished. There is nowhere left to expand. No room for error. No margin for surprise. In this sense, Krypton is a closed circuit. Earth is the opposite. Open, unstable, contradictory, emotionally volatile. It survives precisely because it is unfinished. Its conflicts generate movement. Its errors generate adaptation. Superman stands between these two worlds as a living interface. He carries the coherence of one and the chaos of the other within the same frame. This dual inheritance produces a specific ethical posture. He understands structure, but he respects emergence. He sees the cost of intervention not only in immediate outcomes, but in long-term deformation. To act too decisively is to close a system prematurely. To rule is to rob a culture of its own friction, its own learning curve. Clark Kent is born from this awareness, not as disguise but as regulator. He is the mechanism through which Superman limits his own scale. By accepting human slowness, error, and partial vision, he inserts delay into his own decision-making. He chooses to experience time the way humans do. Sequential, incomplete, uncertain. This choice creates a subtle psychological tension. Superman sees consequences before others do, but he waits. He feels pressure before it becomes visible, but he absorbs it. This is not indecision. It is containment. The psyche required to hold this position is not naive. It is disciplined. The culture around him, however, does not read discipline when it is not expressed as control. It reads absence, hesitation, failure to act. The gap between capacity and expression becomes suspicious. In a world trained to equate strength with assertion, restraint feels like refusal. This is where the foundational conflict takes shape, not between Superman and a villain, but between two incompatible definitions of power. One that expands outward, enforcing order through domination. Another that stabilizes inward, preserving balance through limitation. Superman does not reject authority. He rejects entitlement. He does not deny responsibility. He refuses ownership. The difference is profound and easy to miss. He will intervene to prevent collapse, but not to redesign the world according to his own vision. He understands that vision, even benevolent, becomes tyranny the moment it overrides collective emergence. This posture places him in a psychologically isolated position. He is too powerful to be fully trusted, yet too restrained to be fully feared. Institutions cannot categorize him. He does not fit into the logic of deterrence or alliance. He is not a weapon that can be aimed. He is not a resource that can be managed. As a result, projection fills the vacuum. Some see him as savior, others as latent dictator. Both readings reveal more about the observers than about him. He becomes a mirror that amplifies existing anxieties about power, morality, and control. The narrative repeatedly returns to this imbalance. Whenever Superman acts decisively, the world recalibrates its expectations upward. Whenever he restrains himself, disappointment accumulates. This oscillation creates a psychological double bind. Act too much, and he becomes a ruler. Act too little, and he becomes complicit. The brilliance of the character lies in refusing to resolve this bind. He does not seek vindication. He does not attempt to correct the narrative around him. He allows misunderstanding to exist. This is not martyrdom. It is recognition. He understands that meaning cannot be forced without distortion. Other figures in the narrative respond differently to this tension. Those who pursue power through assertion feel exposed by his presence. Their authority appears fragile by comparison. Their methods look crude. This breeds resentment, not because he attacks them, but because he reveals them. Those who seek salvation through external force cling to him as solution. They want him to end complexity, to remove friction, to make moral choices on their behalf. When he refuses, that desire curdles into accusation. Hope flips into betrayal. These reactions are not incidental. They are structurally inevitable. A figure who embodies unclaimed power destabilizes systems built on competition for dominance. He disrupts the economy of ambition without offering an alternative hierarchy. The absence of a throne is itself threatening. Superman does not desire recognition, but recognition hunts him. The spotlight follows his restraint, turning it into spectacle. Media environments amplify this tension, reducing nuance into binary frames. Hero or menace, savior or threat. Every act is overinterpreted. Every silence becomes suspicious. This amplification reshapes the conflict. What began as a philosophical divergence becomes a cultural pressure. Superman is no longer just managing his own power. He is managing the expectations projected onto it. The weight increases not because his abilities change, but because the symbolic load grows heavier. He remains constant. The world does not. The foundations of the narrative are therefore set long before any dramatic confrontation occurs. A being structured around equilibrium enters a culture structured around escalation. A figure who understands consequence refuses mastery in a world that equates mastery with legitimacy. This is not a misunderstanding that can be clarified through dialogue. It is a structural incompatibility. One side speaks the language of balance. The other only hears the language of force. From this point forward, every event, every crisis, every choice will deepen that divide. The conflict does not need to be initiated. It only needs to be sustained, and it will be. The conflict takes shape not through a single rupture, but through repetition. Crisis arrives in cycles, each one larger than the last, each one reinforcing the same question without ever resolving it. Superman intervenes, but never completely. He stops the immediate collapse. He preserves the structure just long enough for it to keep functioning. What he refuses to do is decisive transformation. The world notices this pattern even if it cannot articulate it. Stability becomes dependent on his presence, yet progress remains the responsibility of flawed institutions. This dynamic produces an illusion of safety that slowly mutates into dependency. Cities rebuild faster because they assume catastrophe will be interrupted. Leaders speak more boldly because the cost of miscalculation appears cushioned. Violence escalates at the margins because there is an unspoken belief that escalation will be contained. Superman becomes a silent clause in every decision. Not named, but assumed. The system adapts around him without ever integrating him. He senses this shift long before it becomes visible. Each rescue adds weight. Each prevented disaster reinforces the architecture he refuses to rule. The paradox tightens. By saving the structure, he enables its continuation. By refusing to dominate it, he allows its contradictions to persist. This is not hypocrisy. It is the cost of restraint operating inside an immature system. Opposition begins to organize itself around this gap. Not villains in the traditional sense, but counterforces shaped by reaction. Some seek to provoke him, to force escalation, to expose the limits of his patience. Others attempt to mirror him, to replicate power through technology, strategy, or symbolic authority. These efforts are not driven by hatred alone. They're driven by displacement. His presence dislocates established hierarchies, and displaced structures always seek reassertion. The first real fracture appears when Superman is forced to choose between two incompatible goods. Not good versus evil, but stability versus autonomy. Intervention would save lives immediately, but at the cost of legitimizing his role as ultimate arbiter. Non-intervention would preserve the principle of self-determination, but at the cost of visible suffering. There is no clean outcome, only asymmetrical damage. He chooses limitation. The world interprets this choice not as ethics, but as negligence. Media narratives sharpen. Commentary accelerates. What was once implicit becomes explicit. Questions turn accusatory. Why did he not act? Who gave him the right to decide when to act? The logic flips. Restraint is no longer neutral. It is framed as control by omission. This moment marks the shift from latent tension to structural polarization. Superman is no longer merely present within the system. He becomes its focal contradiction. Every side begins to define itself in relation to him. Authority justifies expansion as necessary counterbalance. Dissent radicalizes around perceived abandonment. The center erodes. Superman responds not by asserting clarity, but by narrowing his footprint further. He intervenes less visibly. He avoids symbolic gestures. He withdraws from moments that would crown him. This is misread as retreat. In reality, it is pressure management. He understands that visibility amplifies expectation, and expectation accelerates dependency. But invisibility has its own cost. Absence creates space for projection. Rumors grow louder than actions. Speculation replaces observation. The figure becomes abstract, larger, less human, less readable. The distance between what he is and what he represents widens. Inside this widening gap, resentment takes root. Those who pursue power through domination feel challenged by his refusal to play the game. Their authority depends on scarcity and threat. Superman exposes how fragile that authority is by existing without either. This is intolerable. The response is not direct confrontation, but narrative capture. If he cannot be controlled physically, he must be controlled symbolically. Stories shift tone. Language hardens. The same acts are reframed. Rescue becomes interference. Restraint becomes arrogance. Silence becomes secrecy. The moral field is inverted not because facts change, but because interpretation is weaponized. Superman does not counter this. He allows the distortion to propagate. This decision deepens the polarization. Supporters become more fervent. Critics become more aggressive. Nuance collapses. The system no longer tolerates ambiguity. A figure who refuses to choose sides forces everyone else to do so. The internal cost to Superman begins to surface here, not as anguish, but as load. He carries the consequences of decisions that others externalize. He holds the tension that institutions displace onto enemies and scapegoats. This containment is invisible, but it is cumulative. The pressure does not crack him, but it shapes the narrative around him. The arena expands. Conflicts escalate beyond local scale. Each escalation tests the same boundary. How much should he intervene? How much restraint is still ethical? The answers never settle. They only accumulate context. The first phase of the conflict concludes not with explosion, but with alignment. The world has reorganized itself around a single unresolved question. Superman stands at the center of that question, not by claim, but by consequence. The structure is now polarized enough that any future action will be read as confirmation rather than decision. From this point forward, neutrality is no longer possible. Not for the world, and increasingly not even for him. Once polarization sets in, the system begins to behave differently. Events no longer unfold as isolated crises. They cluster. They echo. Each conflict carries the residue of the previous one, as if the narrative itself has learned where pressure accumulates. Superman is no longer responding to emergencies. He is responding to patterns, and patterns imply intention, even when none exists. Institutions adapt first. Governments restructure contingency plans around his presence while publicly denying reliance on it. Military doctrines shift from deterrence to provocation, not to defeat him, but to define themselves against him. Power does not like to remain undefined. It seeks edges, borders, adversaries. Superman's refusal to occupy a position of dominance forces existing powers to sharpen their own silhouettes. This sharpening produces escalation, not necessarily toward him, but around him. Conflicts intensify in regions where his intervention would be most symbolically significant. The calculation is rarely spoken aloud, but it is widely understood. If he intervenes here, he confirms something. If he does not, he confirms something else. The world begins to stage moral dilemmas in front of him, consciously or not. He recognizes the trap. Intervention now carries narrative consequences larger than the immediate outcome. To act decisively in one place is to redraw the moral map everywhere else. To refuse is to legitimize suffering as collateral for principle. The margin for ethical movement narrows. The system demands clarity where clarity itself would be distortion. This is where the internal architecture of Superman's restraint begins to strain. Not emotionally, but structurally. His model of containment was designed for discrete events, not for a world that has reorganized itself around his hesitation. The pressure is no longer external. It is recursive. Each decision feeds back into the system faster than it can be absorbed. Figures who oppose him begin to crystallize, not as pure antagonists, but as ideological counterweights. They frame themselves as necessary correctives. Where he embodies limitation, they embody assertion. Where he delays, they accelerate. Their actions are justified as balance, even as they intensify instability. They do not need to defeat him. They need to make his position untenable. Public perception shifts again. Fatigue replaces awe. The endless presence of an unresolved ideal exhausts the collective imagination. Superman is no longer new. He is no longer miraculous. He becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure is invisible until it fails. The absence of catastrophe is no longer credited to him. The presence of any harm is. The media environment accelerates this shift. Simplification becomes survival. Complex restraint cannot compete with decisive imagery. A raised fist travels further than an open hand. Silence cannot go viral. Superman's refusal to perform moral theater costs him narrative ground. The spotlight that once followed him now refracts, casting distorted shadows where clarity once stood. This refracted visibility creates space for symbolic replacement. Others step into the frame offering simpler answers, stronger borders, faster justice, cleaner narratives of good and evil. They promise resolution, not balance. Their appeal grows precisely because Superman refuses to resolve the system on their behalf. The conflict deepens into identity. Superman is no longer judged by what he does, but by what he represents. He becomes an abstract ideal in a culture that increasingly distrusts abstraction. The distance between lived experience and symbolic expectation widens. Resentment follows distance. A second decisive fracture emerges when Superman intervenes too late, or is perceived to have done so. The distinction no longer matters. The event becomes a referendum on his philosophy. Critics frame it as proof of failure. Supporters frame it as tragic necessity. Both sides harden. The space for interpretation collapses. This moment does not break him. It isolates him. Clark Kent recedes further, not because the mask fails, but because the world has no use for smallness anymore. Subtlety is mistaken for evasion. Humility is reframed as avoidance. The ordinary spaces he once used as grounding begin to erode. Even limitation becomes politicized. Superman now carries a paradox that cannot be shared. He understands that intervention at scale would produce immediate relief and long-term collapse. He also understands that continued restraint will be read as abdication. There is no audience left that can hear the distinction. The system has polarized past the point of nuance. This is the stage where the conflict becomes self-sustaining. Actions no longer respond to reality. They respond to narratives about reality. Superman is forced to operate inside a hall of mirrors where intention, perception, and consequence no longer align. Every movement reinforces the structure he seeks to prevent. The second phase ends with a narrowing of possibility. The architecture of balance that once held now shows cracks, not because it was wrong, but because it required a level of collective maturity the system never possessed. Superman stands inside a structure that can no longer carry the weight of his restraint. The question is no longer whether he should rule or withdraw. It is whether the world can survive the presence of an ideal it refuses to understand. The final stage of the conflict does not arrive as revelation. It arrives as exhaustion. The system has spent too long circling the same unresolved axis, and fatigue begins to do what argument could not. The demand for clarity hardens into demand for outcome. Balance is no longer tolerated as a position. It is recoded as obstruction. This is the moment when escalation stops pretending to be accidental. Crises are no longer merely allowed to grow. They are framed to grow, not always by intent, but by structure. The world has learned that Superman's presence is a variable that reorganizes meaning. Every event is now calibrated against the same question. Will he finally cross the line? Will he impose order? Will he claim the center he has avoided? The pressure converges toward forcing a definitive act. Superman recognizes the narrowing field with precision. He understands that the next large intervention will not be read as rescue, but as declaration, not of policy, but of sovereignty. To act decisively now would not end the conflict. It would crystallize it. The world would reorganize around him as ruler, whether he accepted the title or not. The crown would appear the moment he acted as if it were irrelevant. This is the final paradox. His greatest act of power would be restraint, and restraint at this stage would look indistinguishable from abandonment. Oppositional forces exploit this ambiguity. They accelerate conditions that demand immediate resolution. They push systems toward collapse not to destroy them, but to force his hand. The logic is simple. Either he intervenes absolutely, or he reveals himself as insufficient. Either outcome resolves the discomfort his ambiguity creates. Superman refuses both. Instead, he acts with surgical precision. He intervenes only to prevent irreversible collapse, never to redesign outcomes. He removes pressure without redirecting flow. He keeps structures standing without stabilizing their ideology. These acts frustrate everyone. They are too much to ignore, too little to satisfy. The dissatisfaction becomes universal. This universality marks a shift. Superman is no longer polarizing because different groups see him differently. He is polarizing because no group gets what it wants. The fantasy projections collapse. What remains is an unyielding figure who will not perform the role assigned to him. The symbolic consequence is severe. He is no longer a mirror. He becomes a wall. Culturally, this is intolerable. Modern systems are built to metabolize opposition, not refusal. Conflict can be commodified. Resistance can be branded. But a force that neither submits nor dominates breaks the exchange. There is no leverage point, no narrative hook. The response is not to attack him directly, but to erode the conditions that made him legible. Trust decays. Institutions withdraw cooperation. Allies distance themselves. The social fabric that once allowed him to operate quietly frays. Superman is not exiled by decree. He is isolated by saturation. Every space becomes politicized. Every appearance becomes provocation. This is where the internal cost becomes fully visible, though never dramatized. Superman does not fracture. He compresses. His range of motion narrows. His presence becomes heavier, not because he has changed, but because the system around him has lost elasticity. Balance requires flexibility. The world has become rigid. Clark Kent becomes increasingly untenable, not because the disguise fails, but because the function it served no longer exists. There is no margin for smallness. No space where power can safely be absent. The ordinary has been colonized by expectation. Even restraint is now watched. The final movement of this phase is not collapse, but displacement. Superman steps further from the center, not in retreat, but in refusal. He chooses distance as a form of containment. By removing himself from constant visibility, he reduces the pressure his presence generates. This is misread as withdrawal. In truth, it is structural triage. The world reacts predictably. Absence is filled with substitutes. Stronger figures rise. Clearer slogans dominate. Simpler answers proliferate. The conflicts Superman once dampened now unfold without buffer. The consequences are immediate. Escalation accelerates. Power reveals its true contours when unopposed by restraint. This revelation does not vindicate Superman publicly. It does not need to. Vindication was never the goal. The system now confronts itself without a stabilizing reference. The contradictions he held silently are externalized. The costs he absorbed are redistributed. The fractures widen. Superman watches this unfold without intervention beyond the absolute minimum. Not because he has abandoned the world, but because he understands that preventing every consequence would erase learning entirely. A system that never feels its own weight cannot recalibrate. The third phase concludes with a grim clarity. Superman has not failed. He has exposed a limit. Not his own, but the culture's capacity to coexist with unclaimed power. The ideal was never unreachable. It was unsustainable within the existing structure. The conflict does not end here. It settles. What remains is a figure who refused the throne and accepted isolation instead. Not as sacrifice, as boundary. A living reminder that power does not require domination to exist, but that cultures built on domination cannot tolerate power that refuses to perform it. The stage is now set for the conflict to leave the narrative entirely and enter myth. Once the conflict detaches from immediate narrative stakes, it begins to operate at a different scale. Superman stops functioning primarily as a character and starts functioning as a pressure symbol. His actions matter less than the interpretive machinery that surrounds them. The story no longer belongs to events. It belongs to perception. At this stage, the cultural response is no longer divided between admiration and fear. It fragments into something more unstable. Projection. Superman becomes a surface onto which unresolved tensions are cast. He is blamed for what persists and idealized for what never arrives. The contradiction is not a failure of logic. It is a failure of integration. Modern culture is structurally uncomfortable with restraint that cannot be instrumentalized. Power is expected to produce visible outcomes. When it does not, suspicion replaces trust. Superman's refusal to convert capacity into dominance breaks the implicit contract between strength and reward. He offers no spectacle of victory, no cathartic punishment, no final resolution. In a media ecosystem optimized for escalation, this absence becomes intolerable. The figure begins to fracture symbolically. Different audiences carry different versions of him, none of them complete. To some, he represents lost innocence, a relic of a moral vocabulary that no longer functions in a world shaped by complexity and speed. To others, he represents concealed tyranny, a being who could end suffering but withholds intervention behind ethical abstraction. These readings coexist without canceling each other out. They feed each other. This is how myth adapts under pressure. It does not simplify. It multiplies. The cultural imagination begins to reframe the question. Not what Superman does, but why he refuses to do more. This shift is subtle but decisive. The burden of explanation moves from system to individual. Structural failure is personalized. The world absolves itself by narrowing focus onto the figure who refuses to dominate it. This mechanism reveals something essential. Superman is not rejected because he lacks power. He is rejected because he exposes how power is normally justified. His presence forces the question of legitimacy into the open. Who gets to decide? On what basis? At what cost? The discomfort does not come from his potential tyranny, but from the mirror he holds up to existing forms of authority. Compared to him, domination appears crude. Violence looks impatient. Control feels fragile. Institutions sense this comparison instinctively. They respond by reframing him as naive, outdated, or dangerous. Anything but exemplary. The mythological field shifts accordingly. New heroic figures rise that emphasize decisiveness over deliberation, strength over balance, identity over integration. These figures are easier to read. They offer clarity through opposition. They tell audiences who to fear and who to trust. They promise resolution through force. Superman's refusal to participate in this economy renders him symbolically homeless. Yet this homelessness is precisely what allows the myth to persist. He cannot be fully absorbed by any ideological camp. He resists capture. He remains inconvenient. This inconvenience is his cultural function. He destabilizes narratives that rely on domination as moral shorthand. The cultural response to this destabilization often takes the form of reinterpretation. Stories attempt to darken him, corrupt him, break him. These variations are not betrayals of the myth. They are attempts to metabolize it. If restraint cannot be accepted, it must be discredited. If balance cannot be sustained, it must be framed as illusion. Even these revisions confirm the same underlying tension. The inability to coexist with unclaimed power. Superman's symbolic weight grows heavier precisely because he does not adapt to the emotional rhythms of the culture. He does not become more aggressive as the world becomes more anxious. He does not radicalize as narratives polarize. He remains structurally consistent. This consistency reads as inflexibility to a culture that equates adaptability with speed and certainty. The result is a slow drift. Superman is no longer central to mainstream identification. He becomes marginal not because he lacks relevance, but because he demands a kind of reading that modern environments discourage. His myth requires patience. It requires holding contradiction without discharge. It requires accepting that the absence of domination is not the absence of responsibility. This demand is countercultural. The symbolic arena in which Superman operates therefore shifts from entertainment to ethical provocation. He becomes less about aspiration and more about indictment, not of individuals, but of systems that cannot tolerate power without ownership. The cultural imagination responds defensively. It insists that such restraint is unrealistic, that someone must rule. That power unused is power wasted. These assertions reveal their own anxiety. They betray a worldview unable to imagine authority without coercion. Superman does not argue against this worldview. He stands beside it, silent, present, unassimilated. In doing so, he exposes a cultural blind spot. The belief that strength must resolve conflict rather than contain it, that morality must perform rather than endure, that ideals must dominate in order to justify their existence. The myth's endurance lies here, not in spectacle, but in refusal. Superman persists as an unresolved question embedded in popular culture. He cannot be retired because the tension he embodies has not been resolved. The culture keeps returning to him not for comfort, but for friction. Each return reveals the same fault line, the difficulty of imagining a form of power that does not seek to rule. This is the symbolic impact that remains when the narrative exhausts itself. Superman becomes less a hero and more a diagnostic, a measure of how much a culture equates legitimacy with domination. What remains after the conflict settles is not resolution, but residue. Superman does not exit the narrative as a fallen figure or a triumphant one. He remains intact, and that integrity is precisely what prevents closure. The system never defeats him. It never assimilates him either. The tension crystallizes into a permanent structure, embedded in the myth itself. The aftermath is quiet. There is no final battle that rearranges the moral landscape. No speech that clarifies intention. No reckoning that restores balance. Instead, the world adapts around an absence it cannot name. Power continues to operate. Institutions persist. Conflicts escalate and resolve according to familiar patterns. What has changed is the background pressure. The memory of an alternative remains lodged in the architecture. Superman's legacy is not defined by what he accomplished, but by what he refused to become. He leaves behind no empire, no doctrine, no enforced order. He leaves behind a negative space, a contour shaped by restraint, a boundary drawn not through force, but through absence of claim. This absence is misunderstood as irrelevance. In truth, it functions as a reference point. Like a foundation buried beneath newer structures, it continues to bear weight long after it has faded from view. Every subsequent narrative about power implicitly reacts to it. Some reject it openly. Others attempt to domesticate it. None fully escape it. The myth hardens around a contradiction the culture never resolves. That power can exist without ownership. That authority can operate without domination. That strength does not require spectacle to be real. These ideas remain present not as ideals to aspire to, but as irritants. They disrupt narratives that depend on clarity through force. Superman becomes increasingly isolated within his own mythology, not because he withdraws further, but because the cultural vocabulary around him narrows. The stories struggle to place him. When they try to make him rule, the myth collapses into tyranny. When they try to break him, the myth loses coherence. The figure resists transformation because transformation would resolve the tension that defines him. This resistance turns him into something closer to a fixed star than a moving protagonist. He is less a character evolving through events and more a constant against which change is measured. His stillness exposes motion elsewhere. His restraint throws excess into relief. His refusal to dominate makes domination visible. The aftermath, then, is not about consequence within the story, but about sedimentation within the collective imagination. Superman becomes a benchmark that cultures periodically test themselves against. Each era asks the same question in different language. Could this figure exist now? Could this restraint survive here? Could power remain unclaimed without collapse? The recurring answer is discomfort. Modern culture continues to produce figures who promise resolution through assertion, leaders who act decisively, heroes who choose sides, narratives that simplify complexity into conflict and release. Against this backdrop, Superman's legacy appears increasingly alien, not because it is outdated, but because it contradicts the dominant emotional economy. And yet the myth does not vanish. It lingers precisely because it cannot be comfortably integrated. It functions as a reminder of a capacity that remains theoretically possible but practically intolerable. The idea that power could choose measure over mastery unsettles systems that rely on escalation to sustain themselves. Superman's final position is therefore not marginal, but liminal. He occupies a boundary space between what power is and what it could be. He does not resolve the contradiction. He holds it. That holding becomes his defining act. There is no reconciliation offered here. No suggestion that the culture will mature into alignment with the ideal. The narrative ends with permanence, not hope. The ideal remains visible, but unread. Present, but uninhabitable. Superman endures not as a solution, but as a question that refuses to go away. A question modern culture continues to circle without answering. Not because the answer is complex, but because it demands a reconfiguration of how power itself is understood. The aftermath is not silence. It is echo. A figure standing at the edge of the arena, unthroned, unbroken, still exerting gravity without ever pulling the world into orbit.